Brought to you by Penguin.
Trauma Industrial Complex. Written and read by me, Darren McGarvey. Preface. There's a contradiction at the heart of this book, which I must acknowledge up front. In writing about the culture of public storytelling around trauma and the dangers of oversharing, I inevitably divulge parts of my own personal story. In warning against the rush to public declaration, I unearth revelations of my own. This paradox has followed me throughout the writing process. If I argue that we need to think more critically about when, how, and why we tell our stories, what does it mean for me to set mine down on these pages? Having given it deep consideration, as well as seeking advice and guidance, I've reached the conclusion that the only way to make these arguments convincingly is to subject myself to the same standards and scrutiny I'd happily apply to anyone else who shares their experiences in a public way. This book isn't just analysis of the ongoing cultural conversation around trauma or the rise of lived experience advocacy. It attempts to embody those principles in practice. I become the case study, drawing the reader into the very narratives I also attempt to deconstruct. But unlike many personal stories of trauma told by survivors themselves, I don't just have experience of sharing my adversity in a public way. I have experience of becoming a public figure who's repeatedly identified and framed by it. This book allows me to apply everything I've learned from being a public face of issues like poverty, addiction, and trauma, issues of which I have first-hand experience. But instead of my story being extracted by a broadcaster or charity with their own agenda, well-meaning or otherwise, here I take complete control of my narrative. In doing so, I hope to highlight that while all personal experiences matter, and that anyone who shares them earnestly in the public square is undeniably brave, there is, or should be, a structured process to publicly airing adversity where duty of care is paramount to every other concern, a process I fear we have lost sight of in the race to be seen to platform the voiceless. This is not an argument for silence, of course. It's not a rejection of storytelling, nor a criticism of those who have found purpose or healing in sharing their pain. I have done it myself. I know the relief that comes with feeling heard and validated, as well as the joy of learning how stories of our difficulties have inspired others to keep moving or stick around. But I also know the costs of becoming publicly identified with those difficulties. I have learned, sometimes painfully, that sharing doesn't always bring clarity, that broadcasting trauma doesn't necessarily lead to healing, and that the impact of telling one's story is not always within the control of the storyteller. I wrote this book because I have lived through the cycle of disclosure and its aftermath. I've seen trauma storytelling become a commodity, a currency in advocacy, media, and activism. I've seen personal pain shaped, edited, and packaged for consumption, often serving others more than the storyteller themselves. I've seen how public vulnerability can trap people in fixed identities, making it harder to grow beyond the story they've told. I don't claim to have the final word on this subject, but I do believe the conversation is necessary and that I am suitably placed to initiate it. My position in this conversation around trauma is unusual. I have a public platform. My work is recognised in fields where discussion and debate around trauma dominate. But unlike most people who tell their stories, or indeed those organisations and enterprises that facilitate them, I don't draw funding or a salary from an organisation or institution. I don't have a boss and therefore enjoy the rare privilege and occasional burden of speaking freely while still making a living. I believe this means...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?